Please welcome Brench Bowden.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Brench Bowden. I work for the Air Force Research Laboratory, which is at Wright-Patterson. Most of it is at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And it's my pleasure and my job to talk about the Air Force's journey in digital transformation. So this is kind of a continuation of what many of you heard Phil Zimmerman talk about a little while ago. But with getting down into the nitty gritty, the details of how this begins to unfold in practice. So I kind of want to paint a picture for you of the various layers we're dealing with in thinking about transformation in the Air Force. At a high level strategy, we have the DoD digital engineering strategy, and I hope most of you heard Phil talk about concepts like using models and data more, and the issues with transforming the workforce, authoritative source of truth, and things like that. Those really set the stage for what each of the services are attempting to do right now. In the Air Force, our previous senior acquisition executive, Dr. Will Roper, extremely visionary and colorful guy, sort of turned this into a vision for digital acquisition. Now, acquisition being an important word here, because that's only part of the life cycle, but this is the exciting part of the life cycle, right? We're creating new things, new capabilities for the warfighter. And Dr. Roper took his inspiration from the Matrix, appropriately so, I would say, given the virtual nature of that story, and identified three sort of principles for digital acquisition. One is owning the tech stack, and owning becomes sharing and so forth. The concept of tech stack sort of causes us to pause and think about what maybe that actually means, and it's kind of a powerful idea. How do we go from the tech stack to practice quickly? How do we get from the virtual world, from data and models, into making decisions quickly, making changes in systems quickly? And then this concept of create before you aviate, poetic and visionary. Thinking again about how do I do virtual approaches to development and test and even production before I actually commit to hardware, and how do I shorten cycle times with that? So exciting, romantic, visionary stuff. But it all kind of starts to grind down when you get into the reality of today's Air Force, and I don't think we're any different from our sister services in this regard. We're right now thinking about the future, planning for a future that encompasses the entire life cycle, so not just the acquisition part of what we do, but the test part and the engineering parts, the production parts, and our partners in industry in that, and mostly the operation and maintenance part of the life cycle, or as we call that, sustainment. So thinking about what the future looks like is fun. That's part of the transformation exercise we're engaged in right now. But the reality of now is we're dealing with systems that were developed on paper. All of the artifacts are paper-based, which makes it pretty much impossible to do any sort of rigorous, detailed life cycle analysis without expending a tremendous amount of people capital to identify what you need, and then you're still never entirely sure you're dealing with the latest version of those things. While we're starting to grapple with how do we deal with things that were developed on paper, where our industrial partners don't even exist anymore in some cases, we're also starting to look at systems that were developed electronically, but maybe not in an integrated way. So systems like F-22 and F-35 and C-17, where the artifacts are electronic, but they're sort of dominated by Microsoft products and so forth, which individually are excellent, but become difficult and challenging to actually build an integrated story for analysis out of that. So the reality of what the Air Force is trying to do is in transformation is having wrestled with all three of these sort of modes at the same time. We do have a formal campaign now within the Air Force whose focus is inspired entirely by what's in the DoD strategy and led by some of the vision laid out by Dr. Roper, and it has the things you would associate normally with a large-scale digital transformation, thinking about integrating processes across the life cycle, more reliance on models and tools and better data, changing culture and making sure we have the right workforce for the future and so forth. This is organized a little bit better than I'm describing it into 6 sort of formal lines of effort. Each is powered by teams of leaders from across the Air Force enterprise, and these align pretty much directly with the things that that I showed on the previous slide. Paying attention to what our IT infrastructure is and what we want it to be, greater reliance on models and tools, and how do we specify those? How do we integrate those into some sort of digital environment? Is that the same thing as tech stack? And so we're wrestling with some of the vernacular here. A reliance on standards, government reference architecture, and so forth. And of course, that has always been a goal, especially for engineering data. I think the most important thing that needs to happen for us, this is my opinion, in the Air Force, is paying attention to LOE number 3, which is transformation is an opportunity to rethink your processes across the enterprise. And since our enterprise is so vast and the life cycle of our products is so long, 100 years in some cases, that taking that opportunity to rethink the way we do business as part of our transformation is hugely important, and is really, frankly, the purpose of this presentation. There is an LOE on workforce and culture, and we're starting to look at how we train for the future and so forth. There is an LOE on policy and guidance, and because we're the government, there's a tendency to spend our nickel on that. I would argue that needs to come last. Policies and regulations and so forth tend to be constraints, and trying to rework those before you figured out what your new process looks like maybe is something that we'll have to wrestle with in the future. But transformation of something this vast is really, really hard. Those are all nice hand-wavy goals. Here are some slightly more concrete, slightly less hand-wavy goals. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it kind of adds character to what we're trying to do here. Starting to do things like mission engineering, where we're actually simulating the deployment of resources and looking at their operational value, looking at how we can change systems and evaluating how they affect the mission, and then evaluating in turn, is our industrial base capable of responding to that, or is our sustainment enterprise capable of maintaining fielded rates and so forth. So actually much broader integrated analysis. Looking at doing things more virtually, we hope, means doing things faster, getting things into the hands of the warfighter faster, and so on and so forth. I could spend a long amount of time on some of the individual things here, but they are the kinds of activities you would expect from a large enterprise going through transformation exercise. I do want to call attention to something in the middle there, this concept of authoritative source of truth, which comes up repeatedly. That idea of how do I know I'm working on the official version of the data means configuration management, it means security, and it's not just a recompete work, but it's supposed to help drive integration across the various stovepipes of our Air Force enterprise. And it becomes critically important in thinking about how we interact with our prime contractors. And that all sort of feeds into this idea of tech stack and owning that and sharing that and so forth. All of these goals are laudable and very challenging, and none of them can be done on a single investment. None of them can be done by a single enterprise platform. There's no turnkey solution that accomplishes these things. All of them, I would argue, and that again is the message of this presentation, all of them require some exploration, some experimentation, development, working out the risks, trying things out. And that is the drum I have been beating for the Air Force and will continue to do so for the rest of, well, for as long as they'll have me. So we are, from a campaign standpoint, starting to wind down some of the planning. I mean, some of it continues into the details, but at some point, the planning exercise, which is very people intensive, and has involved quite a bit of senior leadership across the Air Force, starting to wind down a little bit, and it's time to start thinking about, okay, what do we do? And if you've worked in digital space for as long as I have, one of the hardest questions is, where do I start? I have X dollars. Where do I place my bets and so forth? So we face a number of challenges in starting to think about doing, right? We are spending, and this is my estimate, probably 1/10 of what our industry partners are spending. And when I say industry partners for the Air Force, I mean Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, GE, Pratt & Whitney, Rolls-Royce, and there are a dozen more that I haven't mentioned. Those large original equipment manufacturers, prime contractors, are all outspending us by about 10 to 1 and have been at it longer than we have, and that's okay. But we have to be very careful in how we plan what we spend our dollar on, especially since our product life cycle is so enormous. And the enterprise is so incredibly distributed. Then how do we deal with that huge scope? How do we deal with systems that are on paper while we're thinking about how we acquire the next system virtually and keep a balance of investment in addressing each of those things? We are a classically non-homogeneous IT environment, and get rid of my cat. And that poses a number of challenges. We are not capable of throwing it all out and starting over. So we have to accommodate the fact that there's a lot of homegrown stuff out there in our enterprise. There are a lot of enterprise platforms already in place, many more in the works, and working in that environment is an additional challenge. And then I would say there's a tendency for people who are new to this to think about the data and the IT infrastructure as being the primary focus of transformation, and I would say that's incorrect. If all you're interested in is automation, then you're just paving cow paths, right? You're just going to make the same things happen faster, and not all of those are necessarily good. Transformation is really about, how do we change the process? How do we change the way we do business? Almost think of it like a clean sheet of paper and start that. And that too suggests experimentation is an important aspect of transformation. And it could be that because I'm an ops research guy and I work in the lab, that I'm comfortable thinking about things as being not certain and requiring some exploration and development before they get deployed. I would argue that trying to do it the other way is going to be expensive and possibly miserable for us. So how do we do that? How do we begin to work through the multitude of issues, the crazy environment we have? Well, in some aspects, you just start, right? You got to pick a place and don't wait for some perfect solution to come down, but get started doing things. Embrace this idea of experimentation. We like to say, fail fast, learn fast. That may be a lab viewpoint on things, but I think that's okay. The lab has a role to play in the Air Force transformation enterprise. Looking for how business practices and policies and regulations actually, and organizations, including IT, constrain us is part of this experimentation idea. So we want to look at those things as enablers. They're called out as lines of effort, but how do we know they're not going to be in our way? And oftentimes they are. In fact, there are very few hardcore technical problems in digital transformation. Very few things that can purely technology issues. Most of them end up being business practice, IT, and back office culture, bureaucratic processes, and things like that. Workforce readiness. listen to your end users, right? Listen to your customers and your stakeholders, your maintainers, your supply chain people, your logisticians and planners, your acquisition engineers, your test engineers. Listen to them. What is their job? What is their need? And work with them on, frankly, where does it hurt? That's where you start, is where does it hurt? What is a high priority thing? It doesn't have to be a perfect answer, but what is a high value process that is ready to be worked on, and then get in there and start developing solutions. Think about agile approaches, provide a minimum viable product, and especially the cultural aspect of this also is having some successes, doing some experiments, some pilot projects. Having successes generates momentum, and that's important because leadership tends to get fatigued with all the money that gets spent and the empty promises of massive return on investment. So having wins, generating momentum is really important. And then finally, thinking about these things as about what's the purpose of the transformation, what's the purpose of this activity, what's the purpose of this process, is far more important than thinking about how things will affect the bottom line. And that's, again, as a lab guy, it's easy to think about that. If you're in the C-suite, you may have a different view of things, but that is it. It's my podium today. So we have with a small contractor called Aeronautics developed this concept we call digital greenhouse, and actually presented this at the last ACE. And you can see here it is essentially an innovation framework that starts exactly with, let's sit down with users and figure out, where does it hurt? What's a high value target for you? What is your job on a day-to-day basis? Let's define that user story in an appropriate syntax, and then let's get to work on building you something that satisfies what you need, that shows you the power of transformation. So it's about, let's build that right thing for that particular user, for that problem, and then let's get about hardening that and building it right. It doesn't seem sexy, but it has been an incredibly powerful approach for Aeronautics and for the lab in working with a number of program offices across the Air Force. A few of them are sort of represented here. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the B-52. That program in particular is now slated to fly until roughly 2060, which means that the platform will be 100 years old when we finally start thinking about retiring that. So it is in that category of systems that was designed entirely on paper, where most of the industrial base that was there at the beginning doesn't exist anymore. There's almost no viable digital record at all to get started, and to keep the B-52 flying, we have engaged in a number of major modification programs. So we are replacing all of the engines. Soon we'll be replacing the radar systems, and there are a few other major modifications. And for those of you who are not in the defense business, these are multi-billion-dollar modifications to these things. They're enormous programs, very expensive, and Dr. Roper challenged the B-52 to approach these things as though they were a digital acquisition. So how do you do a virtual fly off when you're trying to modify, when you're trying to replace your engines and so forth? And how do you do that with a system that is entirely on paper? And it's not just that it's on paper, it's that the whole program office, the entire workforce, is used to operating on something that is entirely on paper. So there is no databases. There are not people in the program who are ready to operate digitally. There's no integration of systems that makes the engineering easy, and so on and so forth. Incredibly complex set of challenges just in dealing with the engine modification program on this. And the Aeronautics team, which features Aris Innovator as part of their platform offering, has been incredibly effective in helping B-52 through this journey. But we'll come back to them in a minute. As Aeronautics and AFRL work through with some of these customers, in particular thinking about existing systems who are in operations and maintenance, or we say in the sustainment part of the life cycle, start to notice that we can sort of coalesce around some ideas of what we might call a program execution platform, which is not to say, again, some massive enterprise level thing, but that the same set of capabilities appears to be valuable in thinking about integration while we think about this from the bottom up. So from thinking about this from a user story perspective and working up, we find, and it sort of validates some of the research that we've encountered, validates this idea that maybe there is a need for a sort of platform, but one that has the flexibility to allow us to continue to make improvements on a program by program basis. So that's different than a top-down approach to things. This is just a recognition that as we're working individual user stories, working with individual customers, in this case, a lot of work with B52, we start to see some patterns developing in what people are asking for and opportunities for thinking about. And I think about this as, what does the tech stack concept mean if you're in the sustainment phase of the life cycle? And that's really what this execution platform is revealing to the Air Force. Is it's cool to think about the new acquisition models for systems that haven't been developed yet, or things that are very early in the life cycle, but for things like B-52 or B-1 or F-16 or whatever that have been around for decades, there's also a platform concept that starts to emerge. So what Aeronautics has done, they call MilHub, and it is something that is, as I mentioned, has been incredibly powerful in supporting the B-52 as they take on the challenge of how do we acquire new engines and do a virtual fly off and do all the engineering and check what our prime contractor is telling us and accept digital deliverables that are not just PDFs or PowerPoints, but actually engineering models, large data sets, and run our own analysis. And all this stuff maybe sounds like, you must be kidding. But trust me, this has not been the way we operate, especially with these older systems. So we are now trying to figure out, what are we asking for in terms of data deliverables, and what do we do with them? How do we check the math and validate the analysis that our contractors are telling us? And how do we build a data environment that keeps all of this stuff organized? So we start with very little to begin with, which maybe was a blessing in this case, but Aris Innovator is central to this MilHub platform because of its flexibility in allowing us to work with individual users and their use cases and their stories and establish new workflows around this integrated data environment that is sort of emerging from the work that Aeronautics is doing with the B-52 program. And this is focused on the engine modification, but the next thing up for the B-52 will be a radar modification. So it's, instead of now engines, physical, the physics of propulsion systems and so forth. Now we're talking about avionics and software and stuff like that. So it'll be a completely different product modification, but they're looking at what Aeronautics has built for B-52 and thinking already about how they'll use that for their further modifications. So it looks like I'm going to be able to finish here with just a couple of minutes left. So let me wrap this up, and we'll see if there are a question or two pop up in this. Our transformation is hard, and so is everybody else's. We recognize that, but we find a lot of what we're doing is inspired by what we're watching industry go through, which is start with a vision. But then where we maybe start to depart a little bit because of the scope of our enterprise and the age of our systems and so forth, and the mix of ages, we're learning we need to be comfortable with dealing with an environment that's going to have multiple IT approaches to it. We need flexibility in how we approach this, and using agile thinking has been very valuable for us. The Greenhouse Project essentially proves to the transformation exercise how valuable an agile approach is in this. And so it's not that that's new to all of us, it's just actually seeing it actually work tends to be very valuable in changing minds. Our next steps in transformation, again, I've said it many times, it is the subject of this presentation, means we need to get about experimenting. But not only experimenting from the bottom up, that is from the user story basis, because we can't do the entire Air Force that way. We want to do some of that. We are planning large platforms style changes in our IT environment, but we also want to start to think about this from the sustainment part of the life cycle and working backwards. Again, there's a tendency with our transformation plans to think about the acquisition part of the life cycle. It's cooler. It's a little more accessible intellectually to think about how I would do things in the future. But thinking about this from the right side of the life cycle and working back to the left is incredibly powerful and leads us to thinking about things like the execution platform that I showed you. Focusing on sustainment as much as we're focusing on acquisition, and on legacy data as much as new data is a whole different set of challenges. And we're not done doing life extensions on our flying platforms, right? The B-52 will fly for almost 100 years. The B-1 will fly for several more decades. We're just continuing to do modifications to these things. It's an easier way for us to do business. They're still powerful and effective. But every time we extend the life, that's an engineering judgment, and there are thousands of challenging problems that come along with that. We want to be able to adapt at what we call the speed of relevance, which is not to think of things in terms of decades, but think of things in terms of when does the warfighter need this, and that is a culture shift for the entire Air Force. Bridging across functional communities and across stovepipes within the Air Force and managing risk, and this collaboration is important. I sort of downplayed it a little bit, but our collaboration with our industry partners is an enormous problem. It is part of the solution. I don't want to speak necessarily for my friends in industry, but I think some of it scares them. So there is a lot of dialogue about, well, what are you doing? And we want to make sure we're aligned. And so we have to be thinking about how we're going to collaborate in the future. And that's a whole different business approach that has to be addressed as we think about transformation. And if I might just leave you with what the new chief has said for the Air Force: accelerate, change, or lose. And that is, we can't sit on this for another 10 or 15 years and piecemeal this. We need to get about doing this because our adversaries are moving fast. Our industry partners are moving faster. So I thank you for allowing me to drone on. I thank Eris for the opportunity to share our story in this platform. And we'll see if we have some questions here. I see something here is AFRL implementing the use of Eris. So that is on the aeronautics side of the house. They are using Eris Innovator as sort of the core of their MilHub platform. As a laboratory, I'm never going to endorse a single product. It would not only would it be inappropriate, but it also would be a disservice to thinking about the future. What I would endorse is an approach that embraces flexibility, and I will say I think that's what Eris Innovator gives us as Aeronautics has rolled that out, dealing with their B-52 customer or with other customers that they're currently engaged in a dialogue with. So that flexibility is really the key thing, and that is what I would embrace and recommend is focusing on things that provide flexibility. All right. Well, hearing no other questions, seeing no other questions, again, I thank you. Thanks to the folks from Entrada who gave me some training in front of this. It's a cool platform. And thank you again to Eris and to all of you for listening.